talk without the microphone because I feel off-center over there. And I want to be in the center, neither to the left nor to the right. But if you can't hear me, I'll go back to the microphone and I'd be glad to repeat questions and all that. I want to say that I'll try to answer any questions, including personal questions. I try not to get too much into criticisms of policies per se, because I wanted this to be focused on the craft of diplomacy, how it's done, how it should be done under the best of circumstances. So, who would like to start out? My Swedish colleague.
Let me just introduce myself shortly. She has only spent 25 years in the State Department. I spent 38 years in the Swedish Foreign Service. For good or bad. Mostly for good. I'll give you somewhat of a very short European perspective of what you say. Very, very short. Because it could be,
Could you use the microphone?
Yeah, what up here, because you're going to make a longer comment. So.
No, I'm not. I'm going to be short.
No, but it's not a question.
I don't have any questions because I agree. Completely. But I want to say, and I spent the 38 years in the Swedish Foreign Service, and now I'm an academic in disguise. I teach diplomacy at the ODU, amongst other things. And you have to remember that what Susan says has to be against the background of all of us, what we used to call Western Europeans. At my age, my children, we have a country to thank for the life that we've been able to lead, and that is the United States. We have not always agreed on details. On the contrary, I've had many arguments with State Department officials, in the Pentagon, wherever. But we've always agreed on certain things, namely to preserve democracy and respect for human rights. We've always agreed on that. The U.S. embassies have pulled me out of firefights in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, and other places. So, when some of Susan's comments here goes to the fact that we are now worried. Can we depend on the country that we have always looked up to continuously lead us in the fight for democracy and human rights? And to be very blunt, we are not so sure. And that is a sad thing to say. The future seems to be uncertain. Well, this future might only last another 2 years, but it could last another 6 years. And however long it lasts, 2 or 6 years, the damage done takes more time to repair. Many of the things that Susan said makes me think of the value of diplomacy and diplomats. Whatever is said, and this is an old statement, we are the first line of defense. I have been shot at more times than the 2 ex-military officers that I teach with at the Old Dominion. We have counted. Their colleagues have saved me, but I was the first one to be shot at. We are the first line of defense. Some of the times I was shot at was because of misguided, short-term efforts by the United States that we did not agree with. But they were always willing to save me when I needed to be saved. Now, you're president. And by no means will I say that I agree with the tweets. It reminds me of an old French king, Louis XIV, who once famously said, "L'État c'est moi." The state, I am the state. I see authoritarian streaks in the present US administration. And you might disagree with me, but I have a 40-year, 45-year perspective on this. These are troubling times. NATO. Only one country during the existence of NATO since 1949 has asked for help according to the NATO's famous paragraph 5. Only one country has asked for help. And which country was that? Well, it was not Belgium. It was the United States. And they all came to help. Even Sweden, a neutral country, has troops in Afghanistan. My countryman has died for your cause. Thank you.
Yes.
I might add, he's also a pretty good commentator on Swedish films, now showing at the Nero.
That's because I'm a film nerd.
He's a good commentator on Swedish films.
Currently at the Nero.
Currently at the Nero.
And it's worth seeing.
And worth seeing.
All right, some years ago we had a U.S. ambassador who had at least one posting in Tunisia. This was before the Arab Spring. And I asked him the question regarding the state of women. How do you promote democracy when women, well, they don't legally exist, and rights, etc. And I'm going to ask you the same question, because it's been some years since the Arab Spring, and you have Burundi, you have Rwanda, you have Saudi Arabia, you have the DRC, just to cite places in Africa. So how do you do that balancing act you talked about and promoting democracy when half the population has no rights and may be brutalized, or in the case of Rwanda, may be doing pretty good?
I'm going to start by saying I served in Tunisia before the Arab Spring, so that probably wasn't a good example. Women do have rights in Tunisia. They have rights largely because not of Ben Ali, the long-term dictator, but the previous president, Bourguiba, who decided that women could walk around without being veiled, and who was seen publicly with his wife, and who put a lot of money into education of girls. So let's leave Tunisia out. I think maybe Saudi Arabia would be a better example. If you're talking about women's rights, I'm not sure that Central Africa is also a place where I would point as being the hotbed of suppressing women. I think that's more likely something that you see in the Middle East, sometimes connected to very Muslim majority countries that have a very old-fashioned view of Islam. So Islam is practiced in different ways in different places. A place like Burundi or Rwanda, it's not a question so much of whether you're a man or a woman. It's partly your ethnicity, it's partly your economic status, which is more likely to dictate what your life is going to be like. But your question, your overall question was, how do you promote democracy in these places?
How do you create that balance when the cultural dynamics have imbalance, whether it's religion, ethnicity, gender identity, whatever?
Okay. It's a long process. So it's a process of changing how people see different parts of the population. When I mentioned lost causes, I think I was partly referring to my experience in Central Africa, particularly in Burundi and Rwanda. And maybe this example might be interesting. So in the mid-90s, I was in Burundi. This was after the genocide in Rwanda, and it was also after the genocide in Burundi, which most people aren't aware of, but in a space of a weekend, about 100,000 people were killed in Burundi, and it was one of a series of huge killings that have occurred over many, many decades. And as part of a military program, I was escorting 2 Burundians to one of the special operations centers here that was trying to help relations between the civilians and military. So I came with a Tutsi colonel who was the spokesman for the Burundian army, and it was a military government at the time. And then I came with a Hutu parliamentarian. We came and we went through this course, and brought together people from a lot of different African countries to see how the military and the civilian groups could work together. At the end of the course, they were asked to do a presentation from their country, and it was supposed to be 5 minutes long. Talking about that relationship. And they turned to me and I said, no, this is your country. You do the presentation. It surprised me. I was surprised. So we went in alphabetical order, and the first person up was a lovely colonel from Botswana. And he said, I'm from Botswana. We've always had a good relationship between the military and the civilian parts of our government. And there's never been any talk or fear of a coup. I really don't have anything else much to say, so I'm going to give the rest of my time to my colleagues from Burundi, knowing that that was going to be a tough one. So the Burundian colonel got up and he started. And he went through a litany of all the attacks, all the massacres of Hutus against Tutsis in their country, back many years. And he went on and on and on and on and on. And it grew, and it was like 10 minutes, and everyone's looking around, being very uncomfortable, looking at me, and I'm also uncomfortable, not quite sure what to say. So eventually I had to stop him, and I said, this is very interesting, but we want to give your civilian counterpart a chance to comment. So Emmanuel, the civilian, got up, and darned if he didn't do the same thing. They both had the same presentations, but one was from the point of view of the Tutsi, and one was the point of view of the Hutu. So they completely said the same things. And after about 20 minutes, I just stopped and I said, we have to let other people talk. On the way back, on the plane, something interesting happened. These two, set up very interesting. They housed them together at this military base in an apartment. They each had a room, and they shared a kitchen. And so the colonel actually cooked for the other one. He'd gone to University of Kentucky, and so he was very Americanized in many ways. To give them a chance to get to know each other. On the way back, somebody got a phone call, which of course was illegal, but by the time they landed, they had found out that they had just discovered a Hutu prison underground, hidden in the capital city. And that was the end of any future cooperation between the two. So that is a hopeless cause, in my mind. Even though I see kids now trying to come together, what do? You try to do what you do in any place where people don't know each other. You have events that they come to so that they can get to know each other. You have joint, and a lot of times we've done things like sending out into the villages local actors to do plays, to do role plays, or to show films of working together. It's a hard, hard road. And some of them maybe are lost causes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I just want to say thank you. Your dedication, your commitment, your resumes, presentation outstanding. Thank you. It touched me. But here's this, it's not really a thought, but so we talk about recovery. Can we talk about recovery? Will the State Department be able to recover? I guess, is my question, because you have all those talented agents such as yourself, all those committed service officers, and you had applicant pool shut down. There's nothing in the pipeline, so what's your thought?
We will recover. She asked, will State Department recover? It'll depend on how long we have this attitude towards the Foreign Service and towards people who are specialists. The longer it goes on, probably the harder it will be. There are people who stay in there, who haven't retired, who want to try to make a difference. But it's pretty hard when government doesn't respect you, it's hard to make the case that it's a, it's a great career. I think in the long term it will be, because we still need people who are going to represent our views to the world. But some damage has been done. You can't just walk it back, because now, in the minds of Europeans and people all around the world, they're saying, what's going to happen when the next person comes in? And there's been a little bit of that. We do change some policies, but it's generally a more gradual, and there's discussion with our allies, there's discussion, so that it's not an abrupt change.
That actually leads nicely into my question. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and I have some friends whose son has just passed the Foreign Service exam, and they were concerned, well, maybe this is not a good time to come in. And I said, well, it'll take a while to get in. There's a long lead time for, you have to have a security clearance and this sort of thing. Then you have your training program. Then you usually have a consular tour for a couple of years. And in my 20 years in Foreign Service, I worked for 4 different presidents. So it will always be changing. And if you look at it as a long-term future, I would like to think that there is hope for us.
I agree. I mean, I think, so for the students here that I've spoken to, I don't discourage students. I think it's been, for me, it's been a great career, and it's been great to go back and do these TDYs. Cool as that, I can go somewhere for 3 months and troubleshoot and then leave after. But I'm reminded of what one of my young colleagues said to me. He said, when he's asked that question, he says, remember the second word in foreign service is service. So be prepared for some ups and downs. Be prepared to be in countries you don't want to be in. I really haven't been in countries I don't want to be in, but then I pick countries that a lot of people don't want to go to. So, did I ever bid on Paris or London or? So, my advice is try it. I think these generations now are not going to necessarily be with the career forever. I have a niece who's in Turkey as a Foreign Service officer, and I'm wondering how long she's going to stay in. But
So
it's still a great,
you've got a soft voice.
Oh.
It's not inconvenient. Could you use the mic?
no, not, I'm sorry.
So I'm saying that I still recommend it as a career. Go in with your eyes open. You're going to have to be flexible if you want to just serve in one part of the world. Initially, that's probably unrealistic. Be prepared for moving every 3 or 4 years. You will have to be in hardship posts, but for me, those were the most interesting. Washington is a harder post than any place, and you'll probably be stuck there despite yourself. Yeah. Yes?
What you describe of not being able to reach a primary in case of need is real concerning, and it's my understanding there are some places that don't have anybody who can decision make on site, and so not being able to reach out would be of even more concern. What kind of workarounds or other things, if you can't reach someone to weigh in on a decision, not that you couldn't make it, but that you want someone to weigh in on it, what happens then? What can happen?
I think in the case of Ambassador Jacobson, she had to admit that she hadn't any guidance from Washington, that she knew nothing about it, that she would get back to the Mexican president, and probably looked pretty silly. You know, there's nothing worse than being blindsided by the press or a foreign diplomat or someone who knows more than you do about your own country and your own country's policy. There's a system that's set up to locate these people, these high-level people. It's not just like, you know, a Secretary of State or Defense would go off for a weekend in the cabin and be out of contact. There's a whole system, a whole technological, electronic system of being able to reach them at any time. You know where your principals are all the time.
But in case of a real emergency, one of the bombings or some other,
Yeah.
you know, unforeseen event.
We have an operations center, so you can call 24 hours. Many times have I called the operations center to say there's been a bombing, because you want to get the news to them before they see it on Fox or CNN. And then that 24-hour command center passes the information around the government and coordinates what's going to be done. So I think the military is something very similar, an operations center that works. So again, how can you not reach someone, an ambassador to a major country where you're making a significant change? We're not talking, no disrespect, but we're not talking about Estonia. You know, maybe you could get back to them later. You're talking about Mexico. Yeah. In the back.
If you have served in Afghanistan, I would love to hear your comments.
I have not. We'll see. There's someone here who has, who might be able to. No, Iraq, I think. No. Okay. We don't have anyone that I know of that served in Afghanistan. Lots of friends who've been there for a long time. You could actually, and I have some bad feelings about this, you could break your assignment anywhere around the world if you wanted to go to Iraq or Afghanistan. And you were getting brownie points and extra money and consideration in your onward assignment where you would go next. There was this huge emphasis on those two countries. And it impacted a lot of countries that also have a hard time recruiting people, in Africa, for instance. So you could curtail from N'Djamena and go to Afghanistan and make your career, but leaving the embassy in N'Djamena in bad shape. So there was a lot of priority. I think that's changed a little bit now. Personally, I found it disrespectful of the rest of the world, but that was our policy, so I didn't bite on it. I stayed where I was and fulfilled my commitments. Yes?
Susan, I realize that this is a little bit of inside baseball, but if I could ask, on the 25th of January, I believe it was, Pat Kennedy and Michelle Bond in Consular Affairs, Assistant Secretary of Consular Affairs, let's see, the head of the Bureau of Administration and the head of the Office of Foreign Missions received letters, and they effectively were told that they were being fired and they had 2 days to get to clear the desk. A little bit later, Francis Wiggins, who was the CIO for the department, was told the same thing. And my question is, do you have any sense, because that's basically the top of the management side of the Department of State, which is, it's stated the tooth-to-tail ratio is very low. There's very little tooth and a whole lot of tail for a whole variety of reasons. Anyway, the question is, do you have any sense of how well the department is recovered from that?
He's referring to firing of a lot of people at the higher levels of the Department of State fairly recently in management fields that help run the bureaucracy and make policy and help justify the budget that we ask for, not necessarily the budget we get. And your answer is how they are faring, or if that's how they're recovering?
Is the department completely healed from that? Because it was a sudden...
No.
And all these were clear people, of course.
No, so that's a very recent event, and I think it's just one on top of a number of firings. And presidents have the right to, not to fire an ambassador, but to bring an ambassador home. So the distinction is you're still a Foreign Service officer, you might be assigned stateside, but you serve overseas in an ambassadorship at the pleasure of the president. But we are a civil service in that we have rights, so you can't just fire us, but you can change our jobs, which is effectively firing us in some ways. I mean, you're walking the halls looking for a job. I don't think they've recovered. So many people have left. Yeah. Yes.
It's my understanding that all of the senior foreign service at the policy making level have to submit a letter of resignation at the time of any change in presidency. And the president has the right to accept that letter of resignation at any time.
Let me reach out to my FSO friends. I know that's true for ambassadors. With ambassadors, they're often, as a courtesy, given the leeway of, or given the opportunity to finish that tour. They're there for 3 years. Partly because everybody has children overseas in schools that you've figured out what you're going to do with your kids in Kenya or in Burundi or in Iraq. They might be overseas with you, or they might be in another foreign school. So it's an opportunity to let them finish that. To my knowledge, it's just ambassadors and maybe the assistants, the heads of the assistant secretaries. Lee?
Can I help you?
Yes, please.
It's all Senate confirmed appointments.
Could you speak a little louder?
Yeah, it's all Senate confirmed appointments.
Yeah.
But it's not at other levels. And the distinction is that, for example, at the State Department, the head of consular affairs is a Senate confirmed appointment, but the head of the Chief of Information Technology, for example, the CIO, Chief Information Officer, is not. So he would not be somebody who would be automatically required to submit a letter.
All right, so it's those people who have to be confirmed by the Senate, which is broader than the ambassadors. It would be the heads of many of the geographic bureaus, for instance, like the head of the Africa Bureau. So it is a larger pool than the ambassadors. And again, those are often, there's a process. You don't generally fire someone until you've got someone lined up. What's happened is all these people have been let go, and they haven't put forward people to take their places, whether it's an ambassador or an assistant secretary of state for some group or some bureau. Yeah.
I retired from the Navy, so I did a lot of deployments overseas, and I have the utmost respect. We pulled into a lot of countries, consulate offices, and what they did, and we helped them with their needs on the ship. So I have the utmost respect for them. And my question is, because your presentation, though I disagree, it was good to hear a different perspective. When you have a political appointee as an ambassador, is the chief of mission always a very senior FSO that is more permanent in that country? Or is that?
No. So the chief of mission, or the ambassador, is chosen by the president, confirmed by the Senate. The Foreign Service always complains that there are too many political appointees because we want those jobs. It goes back and forth. It's generally about the same for Republicans and Democrats in terms of how many political appointees are called up.
So the chief of mission is the ambassador?
Yes. Are you talking about the deputy chief of mission, the deputy?
The actual professional staff, I guess you would call it, that are State Department FSOs, those are usually there a while.
Well, the deputy chief of mission, with one or maybe two exceptions, is always a Foreign Service officer, so a career person, not a political appointee. And the ambassadors pick their DCMs, and there's a process which has now gotten more transparent. So they have to justify why they pick someone. Like, I pick you because I speak French and I'm a political officer, but I don't have a very good economic background, and you have a great economic background, so that would be a good match, and I like you personally, so, you know, it's who you want to work with as well. That person is always career, and the one time I can think of, I can't remember what it was, but it caused such a ruckus that it's very rarely used. So that person is someone who generally knows how the bureaucracy works in a good sense, how an embassy works, how you bring together a country team, how you feed Washington. You know, you satisfy their needs, particularly if you're in a country where there might be unrest and possible violence. So that's a whole process of, you want to be ahead of the game. You want Washington to know if something happens. You want to put it in context. You don't want Washington to say, you are not on top of things and we're going to pull the plug and we're going to bring all the Americans home. You want to be the person to say, I know what's going on and we've taken these measures to protect American citizens in general and then our embassy people. And we're on top of things and we're not going to let it get out of control.
I don't know it. The other thing is, do FSOs, because I'm in the military, and we had to take a oath of office to support and defend the Constitution. Do FSOs have the same oath of office to the United States of America?
We do. It's to the Constitution. It's not to the President. It's to the Constitution. We have the same oath of office. Yeah. So we're there, you know, despite what any president says, and picking up on my Foreign Service colleague, we serve many presidents. I've served 5 or 6 presidents. I don't always agree with them. I don't always agree with every policy of each president. I'm not paid to be a yes person. I'm paid to give them my best advice. It's the same with the military. At the end of the day, I don't necessarily make the decision. But I shouldn't be penalized because I'm promoting a policy or advocating a policy that maybe an administration doesn't agree with, as long as I, at the end of the day, follow those orders. I think that's a fair deal.
Same for the military.
Yeah, I mean, we're not paid to just be out there, you know, sailing around the Atlantic and, you know, holding parties and hunkering under when there are rocket attacks. Yeah.
In the topic of promoting democracy, how is the State Department these days leveraging modern technologies like especially social media to do the things that we used to do with Radio Free Europe in the Cold War?
Voice of America, yeah. I'm not an expert on this, and there could be more that other people can chime in on, particularly because you were with USIA for a while. We have been brought into the digital age, kicking and streaming, or kicking, streaming too, yeah. Kicking and shouting. For a long time, this may shock you, we knew what PowerPoint was, we knew about PowerPoint presentations, but we really weren't sure what they were, and we sure didn't want to get involved in them. So that's just an indication. We didn't want to deal with all that technology and stuff. There are offices now at State that are much more focused on getting the word out there. I think we probably even tweet, although I have some mixed feelings, as you can see, about tweeting. But people do go to our sites, both embassy sites and the Department of State sites, more often. And they're more interactive and more useful. Yeah.
I too was a USIA Foreign Service
Great.
officer and also on the board of the Voice of America. My question to you is, do you see a difference in the role of those who represented USIA now that it was folded back into the State Department? Has there been a change in the focus?
So the question was, USIA, the United States Information Agency, was a separate agency and then was folded into the Department of State as one of several specialized areas, you know, political, management, that kind of thing. So it was a part of State Department. And the question was, do I notice a change in their focus? I'm not a USIA officer, but I've actually done a lot of public affairs work. I love it. It's a lot of fun. It's really great. I think they miss having their own agency and their own funding, because that's better if you can control your own. I mean, let's be honest, you don't want someone telling you what to do. But I think they're still very effective. So they're the part of State Department that does things like the Fulbright programs, bringing young leaders from different countries for significant professional tours around the United States, which also include things like home hospitality, probably done in this area by something like the World Affairs Council or something, where you're a foreigner, but you have the chance not just to travel around the United States and stay in a hotel, but you have home hospitality. So you might have a meal with someone or stay with them and see what an American family is like. They arrange for different groups, like musical groups, to travel around to different countries. So when I was listening to this American rapper, that was on a USIA-funded tour that went around West Africa to show what the United States is like, a different part of our country. We do a lot of training, we still do an awful lot of training overseas that's connected to public affairs. And that was one of my favorite jobs. I was backup for all sorts of things, but gives you a different view. And if you're there as a political officer, particularly, there's always this unstated assumption that you're probably their spying on them. If you're there as a cultural affairs officer, nobody thinks that. You might. It's a different feeling, and you're asking different questions. I go and I say, well, what is this? I'll talk to an opposition party leader and I say, well, what kind of support do you have, and what do you think about this president's policy? And thinking, how is there going to be a change of government? How might that affect the United States? Do I need to worry about our citizens? Is there going to be a coup? So I'm asking some sort of delicate questions. In public affairs, you're more likely to be asking questions which are seen, rightly or wrongly, as non-threatening. Yeah. That's okay, go for it.
So you worked with different secretaries of states. Did you have a favorite, someone who you felt really role model that role, or no favorites?
Well, Schultz, in terms of getting us training and resources, and a person I admired. I also admired Secretary Clinton, not just because she was a woman, but she was a workhorse. She traveled, God, that woman was always on the road, and going to, not just the trouble spots, but really showing the flag in a very nice way all around the world. She was both of those were people who were interested in being briefed in detail, and I thought that spoke well. They were both intelligent, and they would read what you give them and sort of internalize it. You felt like your work was useful, like you were actually helping to brief people who were interested in the details, because diplomacy is very intricate. It's not, it's not an easy balance to find when you're looking at our interests overseas. Yeah.
From a diplomatic standpoint, I wonder what you could comment on what we are doing and maybe what we should be doing with regard to the situation in Venezuela.
The situation in Venezuela. I think I'm not really qualified to speak on that. I'm not ducking it. It's not an area that I know much about. I started out in Latin America in the mid-'80s during the not-so-secret wars in Central America, and got out and haven't gone back. So the one thing I will say is that initially, when the president said that despite what their president wanted, we weren't going to send anyone home, I was a little horrified. because of safety concerns for diplomats overseas. So most of you are aware that we have Marines that are stationed overseas as Marine security guards. These Marines are not there to protect us. I'm not saying they wouldn't, and I'm not saying they haven't, but their mission is really to protect the classified information and the classified equipment that is there. And there might be a dozen of them. So they're really not a force that's going to protect us if there's a mob coming over the wall. So I was a little concerned because what we depend on is the goodwill and the ability of the government, of that government, to protect us wherever we are. And we've had concerns all around the world on this issue, and the management, Lee, you will be aware of this very keenly. Can the government in a certain country protect us, and do they want to? And if we feel that they don't want to, we start looking very carefully at our posture there and how many official Americans we have, whether we allow our family members to stay there. I will say one other thing about Foreign Service as a career. Prepare to be separated from your family, because it happens quite a lot. Happens quite a lot. So I'm sorry I can't answer that more thoroughly. I can't. Yeah.
I'm sort of led to believe that there are some policies that come out of Washington with which you are not in full agreement with. How do you promote a policy that you're not in agreement with?
So that's a good question. I've heard it phrased differently. He was very diplomatic. He said, how do you promote a policy you're not in agreement with? People have been a little harsher and asked me, isn't it hypocritical that you're supporting a policy you obviously don't agree with? Thank you for that kind and gentle way of asking it. So over 5 or 6 presidents, we've all disagreed with policies that our presidents have presented. At the end of the day, we follow orders. Do I think it's hypocritical? It's difficult. I would say yes and no. It's very diplomatic on the one hand, but publicly I support this policy. Privately, I can show some doubt. I've said to people, this is our policy and I don't agree with it, but this is what we've decided. I can use some nonverbal cues about things that I don't agree with. There are things that I've spoken out about there are things that I have spoken out about that aren't clearly policy. It might help, partly because I've been in places that have been a bit under the radar. For me, I felt that what we did made a difference. What we did as a diplomatic community and as a greater diplomatic community, because you're working with your Western European colleagues, and certainly with other diplomats, I felt I had that leeway. Publicly, would I get up and say, I think this policy is wrong? No, and that was what was so amazing about this protest by 1,000 Foreign Service officers. They sent in a protest via a diplomatic channel that's called the Dissent Channel. It was started in connection with the Vietnam War when people felt so strongly that our policy was wrong. And it allows you to express your disagreement with policy. And I've read it. It's quite a wonderful cable that was sent in, very measured, talks about why it thinks this is, in this case, this was about immigration and the Muslim ban, the ban on letting people in from certain Muslim majority countries. So it talked about why it thought that would backfire, why it was a negative thing, why it was wrong for humanitarian reasons. So there was an avenue for them to do that. Again, this is the only time that I've ever been aware of that kind of an issue, so people have spoken out. I might find it harder now because I have a soft spot for refugees. I've visited a lot of refugee camps around the world, particularly in Africa. And nobody would wish the life of a refugee on anybody else. It's a very hard, sad, hopeless situation. And I personally think we have an obligation not to let everybody come across our borders, this is my personal feeling, but to be thankful that we live in this country, that people want to come to this country, that the majority of people who are here illegally come not because they sneak in, but they overstay their visas, meaning we've allowed them to come in for a certain amount of time and they've stayed too long. That was a little going down that path, but I've been comfortable. I've been comfortable with it. Other questions? Yeah.
How many embassies, and that's embassy, not consulars or missions, still do not have a confirmed ambassador?
30 something? 25 or 30. I know that the new Secretary of State has picked that up a bit. It's a long process. The Senate confirmation is really the sort of the tail end of it, the smallest part, because generally they're confirmed. There's a process of preparing them. But like anybody coming into government work, particularly at that level, there's a pretty extensive security clearance process. So that's, you have to fill out volumes of paperwork, and if you don't fill those out, you're not going to be going before the Senate to be confirmed. So,
to the extent that there are high officials who do not go through that process on their way to accessing a position, do you think that's a weakness in our system?
she asked if it's a weakness in our system that there are people who bypass that
Not in state.
process. Just in general. Yes, and
At the highest levels.
Yes, I believe in security clearances. So I think I think it should be a requirement. I'm not sure how common it is. I know there are a couple of cases that have been very prominent with this administration, and it didn't seem to be much of an issue before. It's a more complicated world when you have a lot of people coming in who are in business, because that's a whole, another layer of complication when you're talking about conflict of interest that you need to deconflict in order to make sure that those people won't be subject to one of the elements of mice. I love that when I read that. Mice. It just made sense. Something our friend Lindsay would like. Yeah.
Yeah. Besides just comment about the Department of Swagger, what effect does Secretary Pompeo have on morale and efficiency and funding, staffing in the state?
I'll give my 2 cents worth, and then if anyone else wants to chip in, because it's, he hasn't been here that long. I think it's been positive. He's obviously a confidant of the president's, and that's important for any cabinet secretary to feel that you have an in, that you're actually offering advice, that you might get funding. He has pushed the ambassadorial nominations through, and so that's all to the good. I'm not sure how that will boil down to in terms of money. Yeah. I think they still want to cut. And once you cut personnel or you close an embassy, particularly if you close an embassy or a consulate, it's very hard to get back into that. I've gone back in and opened embassies, and it's the amount of trust that's been lost. I'll give the example of Congo. So when soldiers from Rwanda, Uganda, and some other countries invaded Congo in a very daring military strike that was phenomenal. And there was house-to-house fighting in the capital of Kinshasa. And rather than hunker down in our houses, State Department pulled everybody out. So this is the kind of message that it sent. This is how things could be not misinterpreted, but how they can be interpreted. So the Americans closed that embassy because they were afraid. And they were afraid partly because they knew about the attack. And how did they know about the attack? Who were some of our closest allies in Africa? The Rwandan president, Kagame. The Ugandan president, Museveni. So they didn't think it was coincidental that we closed up shop and went home. People who were good contacts and were working towards democracy were pretty much left high and dry. And it was, they were literally eating dogs in the street. So when we came back to reopen it, we had this baggage we had to work through, that we had left, not for the first time, our allies, that we had betrayed them in some way by leaving. And it made it all the harder to reestablish that relationship. So I'm hoping that it doesn't go to the point of closing embassies. Even the tiniest little embassy in the tiniest little country gets some satisfaction. And let's not forget, they have a UN vote. So it doesn't matter if you're Germany or, I'm picking on Estonia, but a small country, Sao Tome and Principe, there we go. Tiny island countries off the coast of Africa. They have a vote. They have a vote. Thank you for all your questions. I enjoyed it. This was a hard one to do. I did a lot of research, and I hope that I reached a balance between being honest about the process and how I think it's not working without being too critical of our president as a person, because that's his business. And his policies, to some extent, are his business. But how he carries them out affects all of us and will continue to affect us as we try to work to build coalitions. So, good luck for us.
Well, Susan, we really appreciate you traveling all the way from Western North Carolina to be here with us today. That not only sharing your expertise, but also helping us to understand better where our State Department, what our state of our diplomacy is in this country. And I think that's most important that we stay on top of that. I would like to add, my fellow naval officer there, the comment about the professionalism and the dedicated public servants that are out there in our foreign service today. And of course, when you bring an aircraft carrier into a port, you get to be real friends with the ambassador right away. That's the first person you see when you do. So we really appreciate the role between the military and the State Department and what we play in advancing the state of our diplomacy overseas. And that's probably why a lot of retired flag and general officers like myself are part of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, where there are hundreds of retired flag and general officers throughout the country to help promote the capabilities that we do have in our State Department and in diplomacy and development programs, not only in diplomacy, but USAID and the things that we do around the world. And we think that's a real important thing to maintain and actually enhance in this country. So I really appreciate what you've done and also sharing your expertise with us. And with that, I would like to give you a small gift from the World Affairs Council. It's a Virginia tradition we have here, started by actually Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. Jefferson Cup, which is a symbol of respect and friendship for guests for our council. So thank you so much. Yeah. And also, other than your expenses, a small check to help with your preparation for today, so we appreciate it.
I haven't been on the World Affairs Council board. I'm not going to have money for speaking. I'm happy to speak.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a couple of announcements here before we close. Next week, we have refugees and global migration, so it kind of follows on with the same vein, and I think that's going to be a real important topic that we go to. And also, on February 27th, there's still a few extra seats left on Global Infectious Disease Program in partnership with the Society of Hospital Medicine. There's going to be over 50 medical professionals there, and it'll be a great chance to, if you go to talk to them about this global issue, as well as you might find a new doctor on the way too, because there'll be a lot of doctors in the room. But there's still a few seats left. We have to turn in the final count here, I think by Tuesday. So if you want to sign up, you only have a couple more days to do that. And we found out on Monday this week that U.S. NATO Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchinson will be here for the NATO Festival banquet now. It's going to be evening of April 29th, which is a Monday evening. She's flying in from Washington with about 5 or 6 other NATO ambassadors. And the dinner will start about 7:30 after they get off the airplane and come to the hotel, and then she'll give her remarks. It'll be a great program. Hopefully we'll have a couple of hundred people there, and involve not only the NATO ambassadors, but the headquarters element at Allied Command Transformation, and the Norfolk City officials, and hopefully some folks from our congressional delegations there as well. So a big event for the city of Norfolk and the World Affairs Council. So put that on your calendars, please. It's one not to miss. So with that, have a great weekend, and we'll see you here next week.